When 26-year-old Jake Morrison stepped up to the Family Feud podium and said 8 words that would expose a hidden epidemic, nobody in the studio knew they were about to witness the most invisible war ever shared on television. But it wasn't just what he said that stopped Steve Harvey cold. It was the way he said it, with the haunted determination of someone who had learned that some battles continue long after the uniform comes off. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was the moment when America met its broken guardians, those who protect and serve while fighting wars inside their own minds. Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta began with the familiar energy of a game show taping. The Morrison family from Denver faced off against the Garcia family from San Antonio. But there was something about Jake Morrison that immediately caught the production crew's attention. The way he scanned the room upon entering, the careful positioning that kept his back to walls, the hypervigilance that never quite seemed to switch off. Jake Morrison, 26 years old with short brown hair and shoulders that carried invisible weight, stood at the family podium wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. His hands, which had once been steady enough to qualify expert marksman, trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Next to him stood his wife Sarah, 24, a nurse whose professional composure couldn't quite mask the worry lines that had appeared around her eyes over the past 6 months. Completing the Morrison family were Jake's father Tom, 58, a retired firefighter who understood the weight of public service, and Jake's sister Emily, 28, a teacher whose protective stance near Jake suggested she had learned to watch for signs that others might miss. What the studio audience couldn't know from Jake's composed exterior was the war that still raged inside him every single day. They couldn't know about the sleepless nights when every sound became a potential threat, or the way crowds made his heart race with adrenaline his body couldn't process. They couldn't know about the guilt that aided him for surviving when his partner hadn't, or the way he'd started avoiding the places and people that reminded him of who he used to be. 6 months earlier, Jake had been Officer Morrison, a dedicated police officer with 5 years on the force and a spotless record. He joined law enforcement straight out of college with idealistic notions about protecting and serving, about making his community safer. Those ideals had been tested by the daily realities of police work, but Jake had found purpose in the difficult moments, meaning in the small victories that made the job worthwhile. Then came the call that changed everything. Domestic violence in progress, shots fired, officer needs assistance. Jake and his partner Kevin had responded to what seemed like a routine call, a situation they'd handled dozens of times before. But this time, the suspect had been waiting, armed and desperate, turning what should have been a wellness check into an ambush. The details of that night remained fragmented in Jake's memory, coming back in flashes during therapy sessions and nightmares that jolted him awake. He remembered the sound of gunfire, the impact that had thrown him backward, the moment when training took over and he'd returned fire. He remembered Kevin falling, remembered the blood, remembered the helpless moments when backup seemed impossibly far away. Jake had survived with a shoulder wound that had healed within weeks. Kevin hadn't been as fortunate. The guilt of that reality had become Jake's constant companion, a weight that no amount of counseling or medication seemed able to lift completely. The official investigation had cleared Jake of any wrongdoing. The department had provided therapy resources and encouraged him to take time to heal. But the healing had proven more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Jake had returned to duty after 3 months, only to find that his reflexes had changed, his confidence shaken, his ability to make split-second decisions compromised by doubt and trauma. The hypervigilance that had once been an asset had become a liability. Every traffic stop felt like a potential ambush. Every call carried the weight of what had happened to Kevin. The job that had once given Jake purpose had become a source of constant anxiety, a reminder of failure he couldn't shake. 3 weeks ago, Jake had made the hardest decision of his life. He'd turned in his badge and gun, taking medical leave that everyone understood would probably become permanent resignation. The identity he'd built around being a protector had crumbled, leaving him uncertain about who he was without the uniform that had defined him for 5 years. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Tom, Jake's father, who had submitted their application with a note that revealed the family's concern. "My son is a hero dealing with invisible wounds. He needs to remember that he's more than his worst day." The producers had been moved by the family's story during the interview process, particularly by Jake's quiet dignity and obvious struggle to find his footing after trauma. The trip to Atlanta had been Jake's first time in a crowd since leaving the force. Sarah had worried about the noise, the unpredictability, the way being around strangers might trigger anxiety responses. But Jake had insisted on participating, seeing it as a step toward reclaiming some sense of normalcy. During family introductions, Steve had approached them with his characteristic warmth, though something about Jake's bearing immediately suggested military or law enforcement background. "The Morrison family from Denver. Y'all ready to have some fun today?" Sarah stepped forward as the family spokesperson, her voice carrying the strength that comes from supporting someone through crisis. "We're absolutely ready, Steve. This is my husband Jake, his father Tom, and his sister Emily." Steve approached Jake with instinctive respect, recognizing something in his posture that spoke of service and sacrifice. "Jake, you look like a man who's seen some things." Jake nodded, his voice steady despite the internal battles he fought. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey. I've had some experiences that taught me a lot about life." Something in Jake's tone, the careful way he chose his words, suggested to Steve that those experiences might carry more weight than typical life lessons. But the show moved forward, and the moment passed into the rhythm of Family Feud. The game progressed normally through the first 4 rounds. The Morrison family was playing competently, though Jake had been strategic about when to participate, managing his energy and anxiety levels with the care of someone who had learned his limits through difficult experience. During commercial breaks, production assistants noticed the family's protective attention to Jake's comfort level, Sarah checking on his breathing, Tom positioning himself supportively nearby, Emily maintaining casual but watchful conversation. But it was during the 5th round that everything changed. The category that appeared on the board seemed straightforward. Name something that keeps you awake at night. Jake had been selected to answer, his first time approaching the podium alone throughout the entire game. He walked forward with the measured steps of someone who had learned to appear calm while managing internal storms, but something in his expression suggested this question carried unexpected weight. Steve read the question with his usual enthusiasm, expecting typical responses about work stress, relationship concerns, or financial worries. "Jake, here we go. Name something that keeps you awake at night." Jake looked back at his family, who were watching with the kind of supportive attention that comes from understanding that certain topics carried emotional landmines. When he spoke, his voice was clear but carried a weight that seemed to encompass months of sleepless nights and unprocessed trauma. "Protecting people who might not come home." The studio fell quiet for a moment. The answer seemed poignant, but not immediately clear to everyone present. But something in Jake's tone, in the way he gripped the podium as he spoke, suggested deeper meaning than a typical game show response. Steve paused, his entertainer's instincts sensing something profound beneath the surface. "Protecting people who might not come home. That's a heavy answer, Jake." Jake nodded, tears beginning to form in his eyes as 6 months of suppressed emotion found an unexpected outlet. "I was a police officer, Steve. 6 months ago, my partner and I responded to a domestic violence call. Shots were fired. I made it home that night. Kevin didn't." The revelation hit the studio like a physical force. The audience, which moments before had been engaged in typical game show energy, now sat in stunned silence as they processed what they were hearing. "Every night since then," Jake continued, his voice beginning to crack with emotion he'd held back for months, "I lie awake thinking about Kevin's wife, his kids, wondering if I could have done something different, wondering why I survived, and he didn't, wondering if I'll ever be brave enough to protect people again." Behind the cameras, seasoned crew members found themselves confronting the reality of PTSD in first responders, suddenly understanding the invisible wounds that follow officers home from their worst days. Steve Harvey, who had spent his career reading people and situations, found himself completely off script. This wasn't just a veteran sharing war stories. This was a police officer exposing the psychological cost of public service, the way trauma follows heroes home and changes them in ways the public rarely sees. "Jake," Steve said gently, walking closer to where he stood at the podium, "tell me about Kevin. What happened next would transform the show entirely." Jake straightened slightly, drawing on reserves of strength that had carried him through months of therapy and self-doubt. "Kevin was my training officer when I started, became my partner, became one of my best friends. He had 3 kids, coached Little League, never missed his daughter's dance recitals. He was everything a police officer should be." His voice grew steadier as he continued, years of grief finding their voice. "The night he died, we were doing our jobs, trying to help a family in crisis. Kevin went in first because that's who he was, always first through the door, always willing to take the biggest risk. The suspect was waiting with a gun, and Kevin took the bullets that were meant for me. The studio was completely silent now. Even the production crew had stopped their usual activity, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a police officer sharing the most traumatic moment of his career on national television. "I killed the suspect," Jake continued, his voice now steady but heavy with the weight of taking a life. "It was justified, it was necessary, but it doesn't make it easier. I took a life to save lives, and Kevin still didn't make it home. Now I wake up every night hearing gunshots, seeing Kevin fall, wondering if there was something I could have done differently." Sarah stepped forward slightly from the family podium, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed Jake's struggle firsthand. "Jake has PTSD, Steve. He's been in therapy, he's getting help, but leaving the force has left him feeling like he failed everyone, Kevin, the community, himself." Steve looked at Tom and Emily, whose faces showed the particular kind of heartbreak that comes from watching someone you love blame themselves for surviving trauma. "Jake," Steve said softly, "how are you doing now, today, I mean?" "Some days are better than others," Jake replied honestly. "Today is a good day because I'm here with my family, doing something normal. But the guilt doesn't go away. The hypervigilance doesn't stop. I used to be someone who ran toward danger to help people. Now I'm someone who can't go to crowded places without scanning for exits." The profound honesty of that admission, delivered by someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others only to find himself broken by that service, left everyone in the studio speechless. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of shows and met countless contestants, found himself facing something he had never fully understood. This wasn't just a police officer dealing with on-the-job stress. This was a first responder demonstrating the invisible cost of public service, the way protecting others can leave protectors wounded in ways society often fails to acknowledge. "Stop the clocks," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio with unprecedented authority. "Stop everything." The game show timers froze, the music cut out, the audience held its collective breath. Steve walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself so he could address the entire studio while staying close to Jake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, his voice carrying a gravity that transformed the atmosphere, "we just heard from a hero who's fighting a war that didn't end when his shift ended. We just learned about the invisible wounds that our first responders carry home with them every single day." He gestured toward Jake. "This man right here put on a uniform and went to work every day knowing he might not come home, knowing he might have to make life and death decisions, knowing he might have to take a life to save lives. And when the worst happened, when his partner didn't make it home, he's been carrying that burden alone." The audience began to respond, but Steve wasn't finished. "Jake Morrison," Steve said, turning to face him directly, "I need you to hear something that Kevin would tell you if he could. You didn't fail him. You didn't fail your community. You survived something that would break most people, and you're still standing here, still fighting, still trying to heal." Jake was crying now, tears he'd been holding back for months finally finding their release as someone acknowledged not just his trauma, but his right to heal from it. Steve walked closer to Jake, his voice growing more passionate. "And I need everyone in this studio, and everyone watching at home to understand something. Police officers, firefighters, paramedics, soldiers, they carry wounds we can't see, fight battles we don't understand, and they do it because they've chosen to protect and serve even when it costs them everything." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "Jake," he said, "this has my personal phone number on it. Because what you shared today isn't just personal testimony, it's education that could save lives, help families understand what their first responders are going through, and maybe prevent another hero from suffering in silence." But Steve wasn't done. He began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments of profound connection. "This jacket," Steve said, draping it around Jake's shoulders, "goes home with someone who has served his community with honor, who has faced the worst humanity has to offer, and who is showing us what courage looks like when it's wounded but not broken." The jacket seemed to transform Jake, giving him an appearance of the recognition he'd never received for carrying invisible wounds. Steve turned to address the entire studio again. "You know what we're going to do? We're going to finish this game, but first, I want everyone in this studio to understand something. The next time you see a police officer, a firefighter, a paramedic, I want you to remember Jake. Remember that they might be fighting battles you can't see, carrying burdens you can't imagine." As the show concluded, Steve made an unprecedented announcement to the camera. If you're watching this and you're a first responder dealing with PTSD, dealing with trauma, dealing with the invisible wounds of service, he said, I want you to know that seeking help isn't weakness, it's courage. Jake Morrison is showing us what it looks like to survive trauma and keep fighting for healing. The response from the audience was immediate and overwhelming. First responders in the studio audience began approaching Jake, not for autographs or photos, but to share their own stories of PTSD, of survivor's guilt, of struggling to find identity after trauma. Jake's courage in speaking publicly had created a safe space for others to acknowledge their own invisible wounds. One police officer, tears streaming down his face, approached Jake with understanding recognition. I've been there, brother, he said quietly. Lost my partner 3 years ago. The guilt doesn't go away, but it gets manageable. Thank you for speaking for all of us. A firefighter's wife shook Sarah's hand with fierce gratitude. My husband has been struggling since he lost 2 civilians in a house fire, she said. He blames himself. Seeing Jake up there, hearing him talk about it, maybe now my husband will understand he's not alone. The episode that aired 8 weeks later became one of the most impactful in Family Feud history. Not because of dramatic moments or unexpected twists, but because of the profound lesson in trauma and healing delivered by a police officer who had learned that surviving doesn't mean you're not wounded. The response was overwhelming. The show received over 300,000 messages from viewers, many from first responders and their families, sharing their own stories of PTSD and trauma. Police departments reported increased participation in mental health programs. Veterans organizations saw increases in therapy seekers. But perhaps the most powerful response came from civilians who suddenly understood that the people who protect them carry invisible scars, who began approaching first responders with greater empathy and appreciation. Steve Harvey said in interviews that Jake's episode changed how he understood both service and sacrifice. I met a man that day who had given everything to protect others and was punishing himself for surviving, he explained. But he also showed me what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep fighting even when you're wounded. The jacket Steve gave Jake hangs in their home now, next to Jake's commendations and a photo of him with Kevin taken just weeks before the shooting. But the real change wasn't in what Jake received that day, it was in what he gave to everyone watching. Jake Morrison is still healing, still in therapy, still learning to live with PTSD, but he's no longer carrying his burden alone. He speaks at police academies now, teaching new officers about mental health and the importance of seeking help when trauma overwhelms. He works with a foundation that provides therapy resources for first responders and their families. The business card Steve gave him sits framed on his desk, representing the moment when his private battle became a public education, when his silent suffering became a voice for countless other wounded warriors. Every year on the anniversary of Kevin's death, Jake posts a photo on social media of himself in uniform alongside his fallen partner with a simple message: honor the fallen by taking care of the living. If you're a first responder struggling with trauma, you're not alone. Seek help. Kevin would want us all to come home, physically and emotionally. The lesson Jake Morrison taught that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta is profound. Heroism doesn't end when trauma begins. Sometimes the greatest courage is shown not in facing external dangers, but in confronting internal battles with the same determination that once protected others. And sometimes it takes a wounded police officer and an oversized suit jacket to remind a television studio full of people that the guardians who protect us are human beings who can be broken by their service and who deserve our support as they fight to heal from wounds we cannot see. Because that's what real strength looks like. That's what hidden courage sounds like. And that's what happens when a game show becomes a platform for healing, understanding, and the recognition that our protectors need protection too, especially from the battles that rage in their own minds.